Mission Unessential, Contemplations of a Civilian Lawyer in Military Court, West Germany, 1972 to 1973. Chapter 1, Heidelberg. Ex-Marine Corps Colonel Robert Heinl is supposed to have declared in an Armed Forces Journal in 1972 that when the Lawyers Military Defense Committee sent me from Vietnam to Germany, I received an inter-theater transfer. He was referring to the war between GIs and the military. Accepting Heinl's jargon, this was an accompanied tour. After a California rendezvous with Janelle and the girls, we made our way to Heidelberg, West Germany. This unbombed jewel box on the Neckar River, site of the ancient university, home of the student prince himself, familiar to Americans in the stories of Mark Twain, was the location of both Headquarters United States Army Europe, HQ User, and Max Watts. The former had less to do with LMDC's site selection than the latter. Der Max stood at the vortex of GI agitation in Germany, a good deal of it of his own devising. From Heidelberg Central train station, we went to the Hotel Braun on Friedrich Ebert Anlage, an avenue lined with green August foliage and named after the Weimar Republic's first president. I dialed Max's number, which LMDC's David Adelstone had provided when we passed through Washington, D.C. Max cordially proposed meeting at the Politische Buchhandlung on Marstallstrasse that afternoon. The small book dealership near the river turned out to be a letter drop for one of Max's alter egos, Rita Act, conjuring Max Watts, a nom de plume and nom de guerre, calls for a vision of Charlie Chaplin bursting at the seams. He rolled out of the largest model Citroën, think of a capsized Boston whaler, on two short legs, even for a 5'6" body, in a single motion, propelling forward 230 pounds. A black and gray beard emanating from where the collarbones meet covered most of his jowly face. Max crooked a miniature poodle in one arm, while at his heels nipped a frenetic black mongrel chihuahua. "This is Bow Wow," offered Max in Alpine-inflected English, lifting the gray poodle. "She's blind, but Rita here is her seeing eye dog. They get along fine." Max trilled the R in Rita 5 times, beginning near the adenoids. He turned to say hello to the bookstore operator, who moved behind the counter. Gathering a stack of letters and mailings addressed to Rita Act, Max and I sat down at a table in the rear, and I told Max I wanted to set up an LMDC office in Heidelberg. He extended support without hesitation. I will borrow Shaw's appellation for another Max, Bierbaum, the incomparable Max. Over the next 12 months, I watched Max exploit every encounter to advance the political education of those whom he considered to have had the good fortune to cross his path, which was nearly everyone. Hitchhikers, jail GIs, itinerant students, and American lawyers. He relied almost always on his own biography, which seemingly had an inexhaustible number of chapters, but he was not unmindful of selecting a proper pitch for each audience. He spoke to GIs about his own youth and escape from the U.S. draft during the Korean conflict. He brought sweets, albeit oddities, such as canned lychees, for the kids when he popped in, and dropped names, Rhoda and Marvin Karpatkin, Arthur Kanoy, East Coast legal luminaries, when he was dealing with LMDC's attorneys. Max, who turned 50-something during the spring of the following year, told me of spending the war years in England, where I distributed Communist Youth League pamphlets on the streets of London. How he had made his way later in the 1940s to the U.S., where he was an organizer for the Electrical Workers Union. Then it was on to Israel, one step ahead of indictment for evading conscription. I interrupted the narrative to ask, "What's your status in Germany?" It was a relevant question, since I planned on being there for a year and wasn't entirely clear how this was going to be accomplished legally. Max told me he had his passport and that if the Germans were to question him, he would simply remind them of the Holocaust and the inconveniences for his family. If he didn't wish to be more explicit, I wouldn't push it. Clearly, I would have to come up with a solution on my own. Returning to immediate practical concerns, office space, Max said, "There's a firm here doing political cases, and they have an unoccupied office. Let's see what they say." It was a short walk to Becker, Laubscher, and Becker on Merzgasse. Max was right. A single large room was available, only a few steps from Hauptstraße, Heidelberg's main street. Despite all the rationalizing, Heidelberg truly did possess advantages for setting up an LMDC operation. GIs Germany-wide flocked there, especially during the summer when the evening skies filled with rockets and fireworks, reenacting the 17th century destruction of the city's castle, the red stone works of which could be seen hulking at the north end of town. From the grassy bank of the Neckar, the Amis, that is Americans, could comfortably fire up a bowl of hash and enjoy the spectacle. Weekends were to be our busiest times. Max introduced me to Jürgen Laubscher and Marlis Becker. Marlis's husband, Eberhard, the other Becker in the firm name, was absent. I was 30. Jürgen and Marlis were a couple of years older. As I learned during the passing months, the law firm was indeed handling political cases, those of the Rote Armee Fraktion, the urban terror organization, the so-called Baader-Meinhof-Gruppe. But such information meant nothing to me then. Jürgen and Marlis were friendly, the location was ideal, and LMDC could share a telephone line, a receptionist, Frau Jensen, and a Xerox machine. We settled on a rent within my budget. It remained for me to find needed office furnishings. Jürgen said he'd have extra keys cut right away. That afternoon, I reported progress to Janelle back at the Hotel Braun. She had spent the hours exploring Heidelberg with Christina and Moira. A first priority was finding a place for us to live. I purchased a Rhein-Neckar Zeitung to scan the listings. Nothing jumped out immediately. Checking our funds, we decided staying in a hotel for more than a couple of days was impractical. Max had mentioned a vacant apartment. Maybe we could ask him about that if nothing turned up quickly. In the meantime, we would do our best to maintain the melodrama of travel. Christina, who was nearly 5, caught on immediately. En route from the U.S., we stopped to visit our friends, Claire and Henry Vandendriesch, at their home on Rue Raymond Poincaré, on the outskirts of Paris. Not missing an opportunity, Claire volunteered to pack a basket of bread and fruit after Christina stated her intention to run away. We observed her from a corner of the window as she ambled past the front steps, clad in her Oshkosh denims, heading up the short street toward the busy boulevard. Claire predicted Christina would turn back before reaching the corner. She did. We worried that a lack of resolve would prove humiliating, but unfazed, Christina explained herself. I decided to wait until I learned French. On day 2, again under Max's wing, he and I walked to the Mensa at the university. There he introduced me to Karen and Anna, women who were part of his Rita support network. Rita was Max's acronym for Resistance Inside the Army. I'm not sure what ACT meant, perhaps action or activist. I decided it didn't matter. The Mensa was a cheap dining hall attached to the CA for Collegium Academicum and pronounced CA, that had small, barren rooms and the look of a concrete bunker. Karen defined Southern California Earth Mother, a voluminous body, long brown hair, hanging straight or wound in a careless bun, makeupless and clothed in full-length, flowing, multi-hued skirts, loose, shapeless sweaters, and when outdoors, an oversized OD, that is olive drab, army parka. She stayed with Gerhard, her German boyfriend, in one of the tiny cubicles. She was blissfully, by appearances, several months pregnant. Anna was Polish and, like Karen, in her early 20s. She, too, was a large woman, but not quite Karen's hippie manifestation. Together they were responsible for composing and printing Fight Back, the monthly underground GI newspaper. In the title's odd orthography, I recognized GI Talk. FDA was shorthand for the recruiting poster slogan, Fun, Travel, Adventure. Once in uniform, however, GIs quickly converted the acronym to Free or Fight the Army, or better yet, Fuck the Army. I mentioned to Karen the need to furnish my office. Do you know a place with second-hand things? Sure, she volunteered. Tomorrow we can check out a yard selling Trodel, that is junk, in the direction of Mannheim. I'll see about transportation. I wrote down the new LMDC address and telephone number and asked the two women to be sure to place a prominent notice announcing our opening in the next Fight Back. No problem. Back at Merzgasse, I questioned Jürgen about the tables, chairs, lampshades, and whatnot I had spied stacked at the curbs and alleyways. He told me the next day was the annual opportunity for people to get rid of unwanted furniture. They just put their old things out overnight, and then the garbage collectors haul it away. What's left, that is. The gypsies usually manage to get most of the good pieces. I took a look from the window onto the narrow street called Pluck. Sure enough, there on its side lay a bulky-looking bookcase I could scavenge. The next day, Karen drove me toward Mannheim in a small borrowed van. Without haggling, I purchased a pair of Jugendstil chairs, plus a table stylish 60 years before. When we returned to the vehicle, Karen pulled a hefty meat grinder from beneath her skirt folds. She had liberated it while I was paying for the chairs. I imagined myself deported for shoplifting before picking up my business cards. The next day, I told Max we were interested in the temporary empty apartment he had spoken about. Alan and Ilana Hirschfeld were in Israel, Max explained. Alan was a young nuclear physicist from Cleveland doing research at the Max Planck Institute, while she was, quote, an Israeli who had to return to do her reserve duty in the army, close quote. He wasn't very clear about when they were coming back, but they had left him the key just for such emergencies. They lived in a new apartment building across the river in an area called Neustadt. The space was small, but an improvement over the single room in the Hotel Braun, where the girls had now been bouncing daffily for 3 days. With the Hirschfeld's TV, perhaps I could even watch some of the Olympics that had begun a few days earlier in Munich. Janelle decided we could shift our belongings that afternoon. Janelle was tirelessly patient. During my 10 months in Vietnam and the Philippines, she had stayed with her mother, Eva, in Honolulu. Fortunately, Christina and Moy, who would be turning 4 and 5 in September, were old enough to find ample amusement in each other's company. And where better for 2 cheerful kids at the learning to swim age. But we had been nomads since departing San Francisco. New tenants occupied our house, Dee Dee Donovan and Joe Remcho, both formerly of the LMDC office in Saigon. Dee Dee would be working with Charles Nesson on the Berrigan's Harrisburg case and the defense of Daniel Ellsberg for releasing the Pentagon Papers. Joe was handling LMDC's Vietnam court-martial appeals and starting his new job with the San Francisco ACLU chapter, but making all the arrangements for the rental and living out of suitcases had been grinding. Within the same hour, Max settled us at Alan and Ilana's house. Our unwitting host returned from Israel. We gave hurried explanations, and since they knew Max well enough for them to be plausible, they accepted the strangers with good humor. They even expressed relief, since they lacked their own apartment keys. We telephoned Max to let him know what had happened and figured out a way for the 4 adults plus what now were now an equal number of children, counting their 4 and 2-year-old girls, to fit tightly into the apartment. By taking our luggage out to the balcony off the living room, Janelle and I could later unfold a couch to sleep on. The hour approached 8 in the evening. Janelle and Ilana had all the girls in the bath. Alan and I were in the living room getting acquainted when we overheard talking in the hallway. He said it was Randall, a Black American, along with 3 German women in their 20s, who were his usual companions. We're looking for your neighbor Robert. They're not in, but we expect them. Okay, if we hang out here for a while? Crowded as it was, there didn't seem much reason to refuse Randall. Randall was stocky, with a thick afro adding a couple of inches. He folded his legs Indian style on the floor while the women formed a semicircle. Alan went to prepare tea. In the background, I heard the 4 kids splashing. Words spilled from Randall like a cascade. He was particularly fond of intoning the man this and the man that. At each reference, eye contact went to the women, who were mostly silent, except for amen chorusing yas. The man was basically that malevolent element in the universe keeping Randall and his friends from having the good time to which nature entitled them. They, of course, would not let anything so puny stand in their way. The man could also be white. Randall was a drug dealer, I concluded, as Life magazine photo spreads depicting the Black Charles Manson did a touch it and go in my head. It's a strange sensation repeatedly being spoken of in one's presence as if you're absent. Those in the know connive a private jest at your expense, not giving a sniff whether you are bothered or not. All the better if you are. Moreover, a lawyer's word meant to single a clinching point, the praxis of this sinister art serves to embolden. As the derogations string out, they become more and more transparent. The aim is to build the mockery like a matador taunts a bull before 10,000 onlookers. Randall had an audience of 3, but after an hour, the effect on me was no less than the mounting frustration and fury in a dull bovine. It was late. Enough snickering at the expense of my cohorts and me. I stood and shouted I would no longer suffer insult by insinuation. This salved my lacerated ego, but I doubt it affected Mr. Tormentor, other than to enable him to bask later in his sycophant's echoing adulation. They did depart, however. Another hour passed as Alan, Ilana, Janelle, and I rehashed the exchange with Randall and his entourage. Calm returned to the apartment. We spoke of Max and his energetic networking. He was indeed adept at tapping the unspoken consensus. After raging for more than 7 violent years, the war in Vietnam was winding down by late 1972. We did not need to articulate. Interests antithetical to the world's young people were masterminding the fiasco. With this bedrock understanding, a wider critique became possible. If U.S. soldiers could be endlessly fed willy-nilly into the meat grinder of Nam, what other monstrous crimes were being plotted? 3 months before, I had stood in Saigon. I reported firsthand the plunging morale, pestilential drug use, the troops' defiance, and their overwhelming desire to escape the capricious nightmare alive. I didn't have to concern myself with Alan and Ilana's reaction. We had been put together by Max. Naturally, they would make room for 4 newcomers in their cramped space. At this very moment, when they were returning tired from a lengthy journey, we drew confidence and solace in the knowledge that such things were possible. The conversation wearied, and midnight approached. We stirred ourselves with preparations for bed. Alan and I unfolded the couch. Janelle disappeared through the door to the balcony to fetch a nightie from her suitcase. Ilana moved to the bedroom. Seconds later came ghastly utterances of a hyperventilating banshee. Janelle crashed backwards through the doorway, holding her forearms at the level of her breast and face. What was it? I grabbed a wooden chair, ready to defend, like Clyde Beatty taming a circus lion. Janelle forced out, "There's somebody out there!" Uncertain what to do, I flung the object in my hands at the door, lest whatever was causing her horror should be coming through. Unlike breakaway movie chairs, this one clattered loudly in one piece to the floor. Ilana gave a scream from the bedroom. I looked around the corner of the balcony door to see only Janelle's open Samsonite. The apartment was once more in an uproar. Janelle's body shuddered against me. Ilana ran into the living room believing Black September, at that moment holding her compatriots hostage in Munich's Olympic Village, had shifted operations to the west side of the Neckar River. "He was this close to my face," Janelle gasped, still shielding herself with a hand held at the length of her forearm. "I opened my suitcase, and I didn't even see him till I stood up. He was frozen. He never moved." We quickly agreed. Following Randall's exit, as we were talking, a man had jumped up the short distance from the shrubs below to the tiny balcony. He must have left the same way, and he was undoubtedly a peeping Tom. The next question was, should we call the police? Each of us expressed concern they would take 90 minutes to arrive. This meant getting to sleep after 1:30 in the morning. We opted to call, though I figured whoever responded might be more curious about the 8 people in the apartment than some teenage nuisance. I also hoped Randall's visitation didn't need to be mentioned, though it probably would. In the end, a pair of young officers working the midnight shift took a short statement from Janelle. They showed her a handful of the German version of mugshots. We never heard any more about the incident. After 2 days of climbing over one another at the Hirschfelds, we rented the upper floor of a residence belonging to Herr Pfleger on Mittlerer Geisbergweg, just 3/4 of a mile from the newly franchised LMDC office on Merzgasse.